So my name is Barrett-Lennard and I'm a principal soil scientist with the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development. Soil acidity is probably a problem on quite large areas of the wheat belt. It's probably an issue on many of our duplex soils, but our focus has been mainly on the soils that are more uniform in their profile. These are gradational soils. They're sandy clays going through to increasing clay content with depth. And I reckon we've probably got 4 million hectares in the West Australian wheat belt like this. How do you know your soils are alkaline? Well, in these profiles here, we know they're alkaline because if we dig a hole about 50 centimetres deep, we will find calcium carbonate nodules. And the pHs, if you're sending your sample off to your local commercial lab to get a pH test, the pH in water is going to be 8.5 at the soil surface, perhaps down to 8.9 or 9 at depth, 50 centimetres depth. These soils have two causes of dispersion: alkalinity and sodicity. And gypsum has the ability to briefly open the gates on these soils and allow water and whatever's dissolved in that water to flow more freely into the soil profile, deeper into the soil profile. These soils accumulate salt out of the air nearly all the time. Small amounts of salt fall in rain and also fall as dust. All right? Over hundreds of years, that salt accumulates in these soil profiles. We've done some calculations. A paddock not very far from this one here, we have 1,400 years of salt stored in the top metre of the soil profile. 1,400 years. In wet years, that salt infiltrates slightly. Every summer, we get a dry summer, the salt's coming back, okay, through capillarity. It's rising again back to the soil surface. In wet years, that doesn't matter because the levels of salt are not very high, and we're getting some movement of that salt in wet years deeper into the soil profile, but also the soil is more hydrated, and it's the salinity of the soil solution that is affecting growth. Yeah, so it's not the salt concentration in the soil per se that's affecting growth, it's the salt concentration in the soil solution. Wet years, well hydrated soils, the salinity of the soil solution is very low. What we are doing in this kind of landscape is using low rates of gypsum. And when I say low, we're talking 50 kilos per hectare. Traditional rates of gypsum application, 5 tonnes, 10 tonnes per hectare. Much lower rates than that. That level of gypsum application opens the windows in these soils for a few weeks. And that's just enough to leach the salt in the surface soil deeper into the subsoil, and therefore the salinity of the soil solution is decreased, and in dry years those crops will do better than crops that haven't had that treatment. Lime will work well in soils that have more acidic profiles. In these kinds of landscapes, no. These soils are very alkaline. What do I mean by alkaline? If you were to take a sample of the soil here, send it off to your local soil analysis lab, surface soil, EC1 in a sort of a 1 to 5 extract, pH of 8.5, pH might get down to about 8.9 at depth, and we'd have calcium carbonate nodules at 50 centimetres, and they are forming at pHs around 8.9, in excess of 9. Those are very alkaline soils. The lime effect, yeah, sure, but in much more acid soils. And I think that those are a higher rainfall zone. The return on investment, I think, is still to be determined. Our work is blue sky. We do our work on plots that are 20 metres long, yeah? And so we're not yet in a position, I think, to give commercial guidance. But what we hope is that leading farmers who see the sorts of benefits that we are getting will start to adopt it and undertake their own experiments. In dry years, gypsum is giving us responses of 20 to 30% in terms of a yield improvement. In wet years, we get nothing. And in a way, that's fine, because we're thinking of this gypsum as being an insurance policy. It's a way in which you get a benefit to your yield under very dry conditions. If you're getting 5 tonnes per hectare, that's all right. You're still doing extremely well. But if you're getting 1 tonne per hectare, and we can get a 20 or 30% improvement in yield on that at low cost, and at the moment we're talking sort of $5 per hectare, that sort of cost, well, that's great. That's well worth having, yeah? We've been putting it on with the seed, and our aim in doing that is we want to see the gypsum in the furrow where the seed is. In a way, the dispersion of, if we have mounds and furrows, dispersion on the mound isn't a problem. We're not trying to fix that. And in fact, if we can make the surface of a mound slightly more water repellent, so the water runs off that into the furrow, then that's good. That's in fact a good outcome, because we're not trying to achieve a uniform wetting front in the soil profile. We're trying to create a variable wetting front in the soil profile with a lot of soil moisture immediately in the zone of the furrow where the seed has been placed and where the roots will grow. We want the water in that furrow. We want the water in the soil beneath that furrow. That's the water which is going to be going through to give us grain fill. And it's particularly important, that water is particularly important in dry years. Traditionally, farmers have applied gypsum as a sort of a capital thing. I'm going to put on 10 tonnes per hectare and that'll give me a benefit for 5 to 10 years. So we're thinking about a different approach. We're thinking, put it on every year. It's a little bit. It doesn't matter if you don't get benefit in some years, in wet years. Put it on as part of your fertiliser application. And in dry years it'll pay off. In wet years there'll be no benefit at all. It is the insurance idea. The fertilisers we used to use had gypsum in them all the time. Superphosphate is about 50% gypsum. As we went from super towards compound fertilisers, the gypsum dropped out. That occurred because farmers didn't believe that there was a benefit from the gypsum. And in light soil, there isn't. I think in these soils, there is. And we know we can see it in dry years because with the low rates of gypsum that we're applying, we can move half the salt in the top 50 centimetres of the soil profile. We can move half that salt deeper into the soil profile in 30 days. And associated with that salt movement, we can see the benefits to yield. But over the very large areas that we have of sodic alkaline soils in the Wheatbelt of Western Australia, the benefits for grain production could be huge. So the other thing that we've been thinking about is exaggerated mounds and furrows, and trying to make the surfaces of the mounds hydrophobic. And we started initially, blue sky research, we just started with plastic sheeting, but we've moved more recently towards polymer sprays. And the aim here is to, again, exaggerate that movement of water off the mound into the furrow. And in dry years, we have been able to get combined benefits from this exaggerated water harvesting and gypsum in terms of yield of 50 to 70%. I'm still not happy with that. I want to double yields, but 50 to 70% in a dry year is very nice. So I think that what you can see from this is that we're actually trying to pyramid ideas together, or combine different approaches to see if we can make our landscapes more climate resilient for the future. The problem I think that we are facing is that perhaps seasons will become increasingly drier as a consequence of climate change, and the sort of work that we're doing is really aiming to try and draw together a range of technologies to improve crop yields, particularly in dry years.
G'day, I'm James Easton from CSBP, senior agronomist. I've been with the company for just over 30 years. A number of major constraints. One is soil acidity, of course. Other constraints related to soil compaction, acidity, as you mentioned, water repellents, non-wetting. They're probably the main ones. Aluminium toxicities related to pH. Are more acidic soils, aluminium comes out into solution, and that can limit the growth of roots in the profile. And if the roots aren't growing to the extent they should be, that limits the uptake of water, most importantly, but also nutrients. So we really want to do what we can to encourage the best root system we can get on our crops and pastures too, of course. So yeah, and by negating the effects or overcoming some of the effects of aluminium toxicity, we can grow bigger root systems and grow stronger crops. The greater issues in the subsoil, the subsoil acidification, which has been accelerated by the advent of continuous cropping. So cropping year in, year out certainly acidifies the soil at a much faster rate than the old farming systems did, with pasture lays in between the crops. It's a natural process, but really it's brought about by product removal. We grow crops, we remove grain from the paddocks, that acidifies the soil. Nitrogen fertilisers acidify the soils, and some nitrogen fertilisers are more acidifying than others. So, but essentially, if we're producing, if we're producing good crops, we're acidifying our soils anyway. So, liming is the means by which we can try and address the acidity issue. So the subsoil is the main challenge, because lime applied to the surface takes some time to work its way into the subsoil, and unless we are looking at the subsoil, we might be aware as to how big an issue subsoil pH levels are, as well as the aluminium toxicity concerns. So this is where testing our soils to at least 30 centimetres below the surface is so important to really get a better handle on how great the need for lime is, and also the need to mix the lime in, or perhaps even consider the use of products like gypsum to try and speed up or assist with the amelioration of the subsoil acidity and a related aluminium toxicity concerns. Lime is pretty immobile. I mean, it will move down through the profile over time. We really need to get the topsoil pH to, we say up to about 5.5 or higher before we can expect to see any movement of lime down the profile. Gypsum may assist the application of gypsum with lime. So this is something we've looked at in some of the trial work we've done, as well as others, and we have seen some good short-term results from applying gypsum. with or without lime. But while gypsum can be quite beneficial in terms of helping to ameliorate these aluminium issues, the effects tend to wear off after 2 or 3 years, or less depending on where you are in the state. So lime is the best long-term solution, but applying gypsum with the lime can help more so in the shorter term. So yeah, with the applications of lime and gypsum, that 2 to 3 tonnes or 2 to 2.5 tonnes is quite common, and that's a good rate. I'm sure most farmers are going with those sort of rates. With the gypsum that's going in with the lime, half a tonne again, I think would be quite common. Half a tonne to a tonne would be the sort of rate range we'd be looking at. The crops which are most sensitive are barley and probably subs in this area, sub-clover pastures, and then certainly canola and wheat will benefit from those lime applications over time, without a doubt. The other thing we need to consider is the effect these applications are having on the nutrition of the crops and all pastures, because with those lime and gypsum applications we're changing the balance of a lot of things in the soils, and one of those things is the influence on the availability of nutrients. So some nutrients become more available and some become less available. So with the liming, the nutrients that the liming has the biggest effect on is molybdenum. So that's one of the key trace elements which is important for nitrogen metabolism within the plant, but also nitrogen fixation processes in legumes. And we do see high levels of phosphorus, high phosphorus concentrations in plants which have had effective liming applications. On the flip side, the one nutrient that lime reduces the availability of quite significantly is manganese. So, and the concern around manganese is going to be mainly with lupins and the risk of split seed. So, like anything, you can have too much of a good thing, and using testing services like our plant test can really help us keep on track of what might arise as concerns down the track. The flip side, without the lime, if you apply gypsum can reduce the uptake of molybdenum. So it can be an adverse effect from the gypsum, not just through the addition of salt to the soil, but also there's an effect on the availability of molybdenum in the soil. Putting the lime out with the gypsum will more than counteract that, but yeah, we apply lime, we change the pH, we change the chemistry of the soil, along with the biology of the soil and even the physical characteristics of the soil too. So we tend to find after liming that we're basically introducing more negative charge to the soil with the reaction of the lime with the acid. Liming also improves the biology of the soil, so you tend to get better cycling of nutrients through the organic pools in the soil too. So these are all positive effects you get on lime from liming acid soils. Yeah. So mixing the lime and the gypsum together, there is some evidence that the application of the two together, the gypsum can actually help move the lime deeper into the profile. So that's not always not necessarily reflecting the pH levels we're measuring in the subsoil. If we look at things like aluminium, we can find reduced levels of aluminium in its toxic form down the profile with the application of gypsum with the lime. So the two together can work quite well. We set up a long-term trial up at Bulgart back in 2008, which ran for 7 or 8 years, and that was really looking at the benefits of lime, gypsum and dolomite over many years. That was a great trial in terms of showing us what gypsum could do. We saw responses of up to 700 kilos additional wheat yield over the first 2 wheat crops. Over the 6 wheat crops we grew in that trial, a tonne of gypsum applied twice during that trial increased the wheat produced over the 6 years by 1.5 tonnes. We had a 1.5 tonne response to the lime, 2 tonne of lime applied twice. But we, putting the two on together, we got a 2.5 tonne response. So 2.5 tonnes of additional yield over those 6 wheat crops we grew at that site. Other trials have looked at how liming has impacted the need for phosphorus fertiliser. One trial there ran for 6 years, I think it was, and we found better levels of phosphorus in the crop after liming, but we just lifted up the whole production, the productivity of the paddocks such that the crops were just as responsive to P after liming as what they were pre-liming, without liming. So while you could argue it might have had the need for P after liming, we still got the responses, which was just as strong. And another long-term trial over at Bulgart, over 7 or 8 years again, looked at the effect of lime and whether it might impact on the need for potassium. And it was at a time too where we had an acid soil low in potassium. Do we spend the money on lime? Do we spend the money on potassium? At that site, potassium was a much more limiting factor than pH. It's quite acidic, but this is where it's important to understand what are the most limiting factors. And in that trial again, we didn't really see any effect of liming on the need for potassium. In fact, it was only towards the last year or two there was an indication in the results we're getting that the lime plots were giving us better response to potassium. I think that was largely because we were pulling more out as the lime benefited the crops. We grew more crop, so those plots became more deficient over time. So there was more need to keep up your potassium applications in these environments. So yeah, it's important to consider all these variables. It's not just pH. It's potassium's the other big limiting factor across so much of the wheat belt. So we can't really have one without the other. It's more a matter of understanding what are the things which are going to give us the best returns and long-term productivity. So yeah, just to sum up, the constraints we're facing out there, like pH is a big one. Could be physical constraints like like compaction, hard pans, those sort of things, or could be nutritional. What can we do about it? It's really about testing your soils and digging deeper, digging holes and testing the crops, looking at root systems, all those sorts of things, and trying to understand and gather information to help us understand what is the most limiting constraint in our paddocks. So from there, we can work out how much lime we need, the need for gypsum. To work out how best to manage these constraints, we just need to understand which of these constraints are the most limiting and go from there.